Hello fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. I'm here today to tell you all about what it actually means now that we've moved over to the SiriusXM family. Big picture, it means we are going to make more content for you. Right now, you get one YouTube video a week on Saturday. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to have the Saturday upload be the same, but then also the MrBallen podcast. Well, we've begun already filming those episodes like a YouTube video. So that's a second piece of content every week. Then there's 2 other shows that you guys don't even know about yet, which means on any given week, you could have up to 4 new video pieces of content on the MrBallen channel. And also, all these pieces of content will double as podcasts as well. This new content schedule is going to start early next year. Also, there's one other thing I want to clarify, which is the state of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and Redacted. Those shows were created in collaboration with Wondery, but now we're partnered with Sirius, and so we're not going to be making any new episodes of either of those shows. For now, if you want to hear my podcast episodes 1 week early and ad-free, make sure to subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. Keep on the lookout for more announcements in the coming weeks. Thank you. In the early morning hours of September 21st, 2009, a man was asleep in his bed in New Orleans when suddenly he heard the sound of metal clinking in the dark corner of his room, and so he sat up. The man's heart raced as he stared around the room looking for where the sound came from, and then suddenly, he saw it. There was a figure in his room standing right there, staring at him. And then, the figure began to move towards him, and as it moved closer, the clinking sound he was hearing got louder. And the man realized this figure, was wrapped in all these heavy metal chains, and suddenly, the man understood. What he was seeing was a ghost. And this man knew exactly who had murdered them. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right show, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please take pictures of the follow button's brand new car and list it for sale online. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon on April 13th, 1985, 60-year-old Dorothy Thompson walked into a bank in St. Bernard, Louisiana. Her hip was really bothering her, so she was moving slowly, but at the same time, she was also trying extra hard not to limp or seem unsteady. She knew the people in her small town liked to gossip about her, and so she didn't want to give them anything new to talk about. But, as expected, despite her best efforts to conceal her slower, sort of limpy movement, when she got into the lobby, the handful of tellers and customers that were inside looked towards her, took stock of her, and began whispering. So the little town of St. Bernard was about 5 miles outside of New Orleans, and it was the kind of place where people were generally pretty friendly and everyone seemed to know everyone. But this smallness made it pretty easy for rumors to spread. And most of those rumors in this town seemed to be about Dorothy. Dorothy did have to admit, though, that she had given people a lot to talk about. Dorothy, who had lived in this town for 39 years, was the owner of the town's pet cemetery. Now, this pet cemetery was actually a true business. Dorothy made her income from pet owners, buying plots of land in the cemetery. But that wasn't really the thing that made, Dorothy stand out as the centerpiece of gossip. It was the fact that she not only owned this pet cemetery, but she lived on the cemetery by herself. And considering the fact that the cemetery also had a rumor of being haunted, it just seemed like, how could anybody do that? How could she live there full time? And these ghost stories, surrounding this pet cemetery were not just, to do with animals that had been buried there, but they were about people. Because people had died on this property, including both of Dorothy's husbands. The first husband was a very heavy drinker who regularly abused Dorothy. And it got so bad at a certain point that she eventually just shot him in self-defense and killed him. So that's how he died. And then her second husband had died from suicide. and Dorothy was the one who actually found his body on the porch. And so these deaths had led to more stories about Dorothy and how she was some kind of husband killer. But what people didn't see was how much all this death really weighed on her. And when her mother died about 6 years ago, it had almost broken Dorothy completely. Dorothy and her mother were incredibly close, and after she died, Dorothy got so depressed that she had to be admitted to the hospital for quite a while. She was doing better now, but some days were still really hard. And so now, at the bank, Dorothy ignored the look she got as she approached the teller. She needed to get cash out to pay her handyman, Kenny Pommier, who had done some work at the cemetery that morning. And because Dorothy didn't actually drive, Kenny was also her chauffeur for the day, and he was outside right now waiting to take her on a few more errands. So Dorothy told the teller how much money she needed, and then after they counted it out and handed it to her, Dorothy took the cash, turned around, and headed back outside. A couple hours later, around 4 p.m., Dorothy sat in the passenger seat of Kenny's car as he drove down a highway. They had just wrapped up at the grocery store, and now he was taking her back home. As they drove, the two made some small talk, mostly about the weather and also the work that Kenny had done that morning on the grounds. But the truth was, Dorothy didn't really know Kenny at all. I mean, she had just hired him the day before. But he seemed nice enough, and she was hoping he would stick around for a while. After all, she had had a pretty high turnover rate amongst her handymen over the last year, and so she was hoping now for some consistency. So both the pet cemetery itself and Dorothy's house, which again was on the cemetery grounds, required a lot of upkeep that Dorothy was just not physically capable of doing. Besides her bad hip, she also took medication for her depression that made her weak and sometimes very disoriented. Now, sometimes Dorothy would ask her neighbors for help, but generally speaking, she preferred to just hire people to do the work because, people needed steady work, she could give that to them, and she appreciated the help. However, the problem with hiring these handymen was that unfortunately, a few of her, former handymen had turned out to be criminals. Last fall, her handyman at the time, this guy named Elkin Childress, had lived with her and worked on the grounds, but Elkin was always just sort of wandering around and exploring the property instead of taking care of it. Then she had found out he'd been arrested for robbery, so she guessed that what he was really doing when he was walking around was casing the place, looking for ways to break in or to steal something. Luckily for her, he actually quit before she had to fire him. And the guy before Elkin was even worse. His name was Brandon Nodier. Brandon was a total loudmouth who had started working for Dorothy right after her mother had died. He and his wife Bonnie had moved in with Dorothy, so Brandon could keep up with the repairs while Bonnie drove Dorothy around. But, just like Elkin, the issue she ran into with the Nodiers was theft. The previous spring, Dorothy had had this really intense depressive episode and was taking a lot of medication for it. And while she was all, medicated and groggy, the Nodiers convinced her to sell them her land for basically nothing. But when Dorothy realized what had happened, she made the Nodiers move out and then got a lawyer to overturn the deal that she had signed. And so since last year, Dorothy, along with the Nodiers, had been in this horrible legal fight over this land. And she knew, the Nodiers, Brandon and Bonnie, were furious at her. And on top of that, Brandon, who was this huge loudmouth, just would not stop talking about this dispute. Not only was he talking about it in public, but he also kept contacting Dorothy to sort of talk her into dropping the suit altogether. But Dorothy was not about to drop this issue. I mean, this cemetery and the land had belonged to her mother, and now it was hers, like it mattered to her. She's not just gonna give it up. And so now, sitting in the passenger seat of the car, Dorothy watched as Kenny turned off the highway and eventually pulled into her driveway, which was quite long and wound through some thick woods, because remember, she lives on the cemetery. It's sort of secluded from society. And as the pair drove along this driveway and got closer and closer to her home, eventually she could finally see some of the tombstones up ahead. This cemetery was enormous, and basically any kind of animal you could imagine was buried here. Some of the graves were just engraved stone slabs, but others were pretty extravagant, including one human-sized Buddhist statue of somebody's pet cat. Kenny finally pulled up in front of the house and got out to help Dorothy carry in the groceries. And when he was done, Dorothy handed over the cash that she owed him and said she would call him when she had more work. Then she watched as Kenny got back in his car and drove off back down the driveway. Around 9 p.m. that night, Dorothy poured herself a healthy glass of wine and went to her bedroom to turn on the TV. She'd spent the evening going through some bills and taking calls from cemetery clients, so by now she was exhausted. But as soon as she got into bed, she heard her phone ring on the other side of the house. Dorothy groaned and took her wine with her as she shuffled down the hallway to the kitchen to answer the call. And when she answered it, she heard her friend's voice, a woman named Patricia Newman. So Patricia was about half Dorothy's age, and the two of them had been introduced by a mutual friend 3 years earlier. Patricia had started out as more of a caretaker for Dorothy, since Patricia had experience working with the elderly. But they'd gotten along really well and became quite close, to the point where they had sort of a mother-daughter type of relationship. And since Patricia only lived about 10 minutes away, Dorothy did depend on her pretty much daily for things like supervising her medication and driving her to appointments. In many ways, Patricia was like the one person outside of the hired help that she did spend a lot of time with. And so that's actually why Patricia was calling now. She wanted to know if Dorothy still needed a ride to the pharmacy the following day. And Dorothy said that she did and said thank you. And then the two talked for a bit longer before ultimately saying goodnight. After that, Dorothy hung up the phone and then poured herself a bit more wine. And then she just kind of stood in the kitchen for a bit, listening to the crickets outside. And then, when she was about to finally leave and go back to bed, she heard something. It was the sound of a car making their way slowly up her long driveway. The following morning, a little after 1 p.m., the friend, Patricia Newman, pulled up outside of Dorothy's house and threw her car into park. Patricia had called Dorothy around 9 a.m. that morning to tell her she was going to be late getting her. But Dorothy hadn't answered. Patricia had tried calling a few more times, but Dorothy never answered, which ultimately made Patricia pretty nervous. Dorothy was a heavy drinker in her 60s and was on a lot of medication. So deep down, Patricia knew it was possible Dorothy wasn't answering because she'd had some kind of accident or medical emergency. So she was at Dorothy's now, not so much to take her on her errands for the day, but just to make sure she was okay. Patricia got out of her car and hurried up to Dorothy's front door. But when she knocked, there was no answer. And after looking in a few windows, she didn't see Dorothy or any kind of movement inside. It just seemed very quiet and still. Patricia went back to the front door and tried it, but she found it was locked. So she just kept on knocking for a while. And after a few more minutes of Dorothy not answering and not hearing or seeing any sign of life in there, Patricia felt worried enough that she left the front door and went to go call the police. Not long after that, Patricia was back at Dorothy's house, this time watching anxiously as two police officers forced Dorothy's back door open. The officers had gotten there just a few minutes ago, and Patricia had explained to them how Dorothy, could be inside and very likely was hurt or something was wrong here. And so the officers kind of fanned out and began searching around the house looking for a way in, and they found the back door was not locked, it was just jammed. So now they were in the process of getting it unjammed. And so finally, after a few swift kicks to this door, it finally gave way and it swung open, and the two officers, along with Patricia, went inside. Patricia immediately began yelling out Dorothy's name and going room to room looking for her, and what she quickly realized is she could hear the sound of a television that was on, and it was coming from Dorothy's bedroom. But when she went to the bedroom and looked inside, Dorothy wasn't in there. In fact, after searching the whole house, there was no sign of Dorothy anywhere. And there wasn't any sign of any kind of problem in the house, like there was no disturbance anywhere, no struggle, no accident where somebody fell over. It was just like Dorothy was gone, and that was it. Now, for the two officers, they didn't really know what to make of this, because to them, it didn't appear like anything horrible had happened. There was no active emergency here. It's just that, this person has left their TV on and they're not here when they should be. And that was concerning, but not enough to warrant a big reaction from authorities. But Patricia, she knew, based on what she was seeing, that this was so uncharacteristic of Dorothy that something definitely had gone wrong here. But even though Patricia really adamantly communicated that concern to the two officers, they just told her that, let's wait, give it a few days, and give Dorothy another couple of calls, and if she doesn't show up in the next few days, come talk to us. And so after the police left, despite Patricia having this sense that something's off here, she did what she was told. She went home, she continued trying Dorothy, but never got an answer. She called around town to see if anybody had seen her or heard from her, but no, nobody knew where she was. And so finally, after 4 days, Patricia put in another call to the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office. And this time, she absolutely begged them to do something, because Dorothy Thompson was still missing, and now Patricia was 100% certain that something bad had to have happened to her. At around 10:30 a.m. on the same day that Patricia has made this plea for help 4 days after Dorothy had inexplicably gone missing, Detective Brian Vallelongo drove his cruiser through Dorothy Thompson's pet cemetery along with Sergeant Terrence Strada. Both men worked for the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office, and they had been tasked to look into Dorothy's disappearance. Vallelongo hadn't even gotten to the scene yet, but he was already uneasy as he drove past the animal tombstones and grave sites. This place had always creeped him out. Finally, the officer's cruiser made their way all the way to the end of the driveway, and they reached Dorothy's home. And right away, Vallelongo could see there was a woman, maybe in her 30s, who he guessed was Patricia, who was standing by the front door. She seemed visibly anxious and impatient as she stood there waiting for Vallelongo and Strada to get out of their car. And when they did get out and walked over to her, she got straight to the point. She said the last officers had not actually done a real search of the place, just a sort of basic welfare check. And so now she needed them to do a full search of Dorothy's house and her grounds to make sure Dorothy really wasn't somewhere on this property. Vallelongo and Strada assured her that they would do that. But first, they needed her to start from the beginning and tell them about the last time she saw or spoke to Dorothy. Patricia seemed pretty irritated by this and said she'd already told the officers everything she had known, both on the phone call and then previously with those other officers who had done the welfare check. Like, can we please just get into the search? But Vallelongo insisted and said, look, I don't fully know the whole story, so please, give me some information. And so, begrudgingly, she would tell Vallelongo what she knew. Basically that she had called her friend on the 13th at night to ask if Dorothy would need a ride to the pharmacy the next day. She had said yes, and then the next day comes around and Patricia calls her friend to confirm she's going to swing by and pick her up that morning, but Dorothy doesn't answer. And so eventually Patricia goes to the house. Dorothy apparently isn't there. She knocks on the door. Dorothy doesn't come out. It just seemed off. And so Patricia calls the police. They show up. They find the back door is unlocked but jammed. They force it open. They go inside and, nothing's disturbed. And Dorothy is just missing. And there was no rhyme or reason to it. And so now Patricia was convinced that something bad had happened to Dorothy. And she really was hoping that they could help her. Vallelongo nodded and then asked Patricia if maybe Dorothy had friends or family that she might have just gone to stay with. But Patricia immediately shook her head and said no. Dorothy was pretty much alone in the world and almost never left her house. And she didn't have a car because she didn't drive. Also, Patricia said she had already called around and nobody had seen her. Friends, family, no one. And then at this point, Patricia was very clear. She told the officers that she believed the only reason Dorothy would have left her house that day or that night before was if somebody else had forced her to. Vallelongo shot Strada a look. He didn't doubt that Patricia was worried about her friend, but they need to look around before they jump to any conclusions here. So he asked Patricia if she could show them the unlocked door, and they would begin their investigation. Moments later, Vallelongo stepped into the home through that back entrance, followed by Strada and Patricia. As he walked around the house, he saw that, like Patricia had said, it was very neat and tidy. There really was no sign of anything that had gone wrong inside the house. No sign of a struggle or a fall of some kind. It was just like the house was left exactly as is. That sort of contradicted Patricia's theory that, the only way Dorothy would have left the house was if she had been forced, suggesting some form of a struggle. But at the same time, what Patricia was saying about Dorothy is that she was kind of frail. And so Vallelongo thought, okay, maybe it's possible that she was forced and, she didn't put up any kind of a fight, and that's why we don't see any disturbance. He didn't know, but it just seemed odd that nothing had been displaced if we're talking about some form of an abduction. Also, as Vallelongo continued his walk around the house, he could see that items of value, like Dorothy's TV, were still there. So it didn't seem like this had been a robbery. But unlike the first officers who had done that initial welfare check with Patricia a few days earlier, Vallelongo did agree that something wasn't right here. Because as he continued to walk around, he kept seeing signs that Dorothy had clearly not planned to leave her home or had left in a hurry. For example, there was a half-empty glass of wine in the kitchen, and the television in the bedroom was still on. And so those are things that simply would not be if somebody was planning to leave for any extended period of time. And also, based on what Patricia had told them, he could rule out a family emergency suddenly taking Dorothy out of town or any kind of last-minute trip, because Patricia had called around and that stuff hadn't happened. At a certain point, Vallelongo stopped walking around the home and just asked Patricia, how was Dorothy's mental state? And Patricia clearly hesitated for a second before she admitted to Vallelongo that, Dorothy was on a whole bunch of medication, and sometimes it did make her mental state kind of foggy. And so Vallelongo naturally thought, okay, maybe it's possible that in a sort of foggy mental state, maybe for whatever reason, she wandered out of the house on her own, and then once she was outside, something happened to her, whether it was, an animal, a person, a fall, like anything could have happened. He knew the back door had been unlocked during that initial police welfare check, and even though he knew the door apparently had been jammed, it clearly had not been jammed so much that it prevented them from getting inside. And so maybe that door just always got stuck, and maybe that's all that happened. She walked out the back door, and when she shut it, it got jammed, and that was normal. And so Vallelongo turned to his partner and sort of explained to him his theory around Dorothy maybe wandering out on her own, and then something else happened once she was outside, and said, hey, she's clearly not here. Let's go out there and search the grounds and see if we can find her. "15 days later, a little past 7 a.m. on May 3rd, 1985, Vallelongo stepped into Strada's office to give him an update on the case. At this point, Vallelongo thought it was extremely likely that foul play was involved here, because they had searched Dorothy's house and her property a few times at this point, and they had not found Dorothy anywhere, or any evidence to explain what had happened to her. Patricia had mentioned that Dorothy had a tattoo of a cross on her left index finger. So Vallelongo had spent the last couple of weeks calling around to local hospitals and morgues to see if any women had been brought in with that marking. Vallelongo also interviewed Dorothy's neighbors and the tellers at that bank that she had gone to shortly before she vanished, and also he had interviewed some people in town who just knew who she was. He'd also tracked down Dorothy's new handyman, Kenny Pommier, who the bank had said was with Dorothy on the day she vanished. He apparently was driving her around. But none of these people had heard from Dorothy since she vanished 20 days earlier, same as Patricia. Even though nobody knew where Dorothy was and really couldn't offer all that much information to help the investigation, it was like everybody Vallelongo spoke to had a pretty strong negative opinion of Dorothy. Like that she was this recluse and that she was kind of crazy, and people thought she had murdered her husbands and buried their bodies in the pet cemetery, and also her house and her land were haunted. But, none of these rumors were going to do anything to advance the case. But it was interesting to Vallelongo that people felt this way about her. The only real lead that Vallelongo got was something he got from speaking to Dorothy's lawyer a few days ago, who had mentioned that Dorothy was in the middle of this very contentious lawsuit over the rights to her property with a pair of former employees named Bonnie and Brandon Nodier. And since Dorothy's case was looking more and more like an abduction or even homicide, the fact that there was this active lawsuit that Dorothy was embroiled in was a big red flag. So Vallelongo naturally knew he had to speak to Bonnie and Brandon. But as Vallelongo sat across from Strada at his desk and filled him in on all this, Strada's phone rang. Strada picked it up and listened to the person on the other end, and immediately there was this look of shock that came over his face. Strada thanked the caller and then hung up, and then told Vallelongo that a body had been found in the Mississippi River the day before, about 40 miles downriver from here, and they thought it could be Dorothy. Just a few hours later, Vallelongo and Strada stood with Patricia Newman inside of an exam room at the coroner's office. In front of them was a long metal table, and lying on this table was the body of the woman who had been found inside the river. Patricia had been asked to come in here and see if this was Dorothy. But as Vallelongo looked at the body, he didn't see how Patricia was going to be able to do that, because the body was already incredibly decomposed and very bloated. The medical examiner had said this woman had likely been in the water for weeks, and they hadn't done an autopsy yet, but any findings would probably just be a guess because of how badly damaged and decomposed the body was. The only thing they did know for sure was that this definitely was a homicide. The woman was found with a plastic bag tied over her head, and she was wrapped in a lot of very heavy chains, probably to weigh her down so her body would not float up and be found. And so Vallelongo looked over at Patricia, who looked visibly anxious as she stared at this body. She seemed kind of overwhelmed by the moment. She was shaking and she was just staring, sort of shocked. But eventually, after looking at the body, she spoke. And she actually said that she didn't think this was Dorothy. And for a second, Vallelongo was actually disappointed, not because he was hoping Dorothy was dead, but for the sake of the case, to figure out where she had gone. But then he remembered something. He stepped up to the body, he put on a glove, and gently examined the woman's left hand. And there, just visible on her index finger, was a tattoo of a cross. This was Dorothy. Four days later, on May 7th, Vallelongo got to his office and sat down at his desk to start the day. And he had a lot to do, because he was now in the middle of a homicide case. The medical examiner who had done the autopsy on Dorothy didn't find any water in her lungs. So as a result, they had decided the cause of death was most likely asphyxia from strangulation or suffocation, not drowning. Now, Vallelongo had known all along that it was possible somebody had abducted Dorothy from her home and killed her. But now that it was official, he was sort of reviewing the case notes from the beginning to see if anything had been overlooked while this was still basically considered a missing persons case. And he started with the place Dorothy was last known to be, her house. Dorothy's home was incredibly neat and undisturbed, so it was possible Dorothy was lured from her home and killed somewhere else. But Vallelongo knew from talking to her neighbors and Patricia that Dorothy was, naturally pretty reclusive and did not leave her house easily. So it sort of made the most sense to him that Dorothy must have actually been killed in her home, and the reason the crime scene was so pristine was that Dorothy was overpowered really quickly. Now, originally, Vallelongo had considered Dorothy's current handyman, Kenny Pommier, to be a suspect, since he was the last one to see her alive, because he was the one who dropped her off at her home at 4 p.m., around the time she went missing. But Vallelongo had revisited Kenny and found that he had an alibi. But even if he didn't have an alibi, Vallelongo wasn't really sure what Kenny's motive would even have been. I mean, there'd been no sign of a robbery inside of her house. And on top of that, it just didn't seem like Dorothy had much money to begin with, like she wasn't wealthy. And also the way she died, strangulation or suffocation, that's so personal. And so whoever would have done that would have had to have a reason for it. But so far, Vallelongo had not spoken to anyone who really had a serious issue with Dorothy. I mean, people definitely had opinions about Dorothy, but it was almost like people said, stay away from her. She lives on haunted land and she's killed her husbands, but it just seemed like rumor mill. There didn't seem to be somebody who really had a targeted issue with her. There was that outstanding lawsuit with the Nodiers, the two people who were, battling over the rights to her property, but it wasn't clear to Vallelongo if in the middle of this lawsuit was like real hatred between the parties. He had yet to see that. And so at this point, Vallelongo felt like his biggest problem was that he really had no real evidence. There were no witnesses, and they'd searched Dorothy's house repeatedly at this point, and they hadn't found anything useful. And there were no forensics on Dorothy's body. Since her body had been in the water for so long, all the forensics had been washed away. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and an officer poked his head in and told Vallelongo that he had something that he might want to come see. And so Vallelongo got up and he walked over, and the officer said that they had just brought this guy in for writing bad checks, and it turns out his former employer was Dorothy Thompson. Vallelongo was immediately interested and asked for more information. And the officer told him that this man's name was Elkin Childress, and he had been the live-in caretaker for Dorothy for 2 months last fall. And Elkin had told the officers who had arrested him that the reason he had wanted to work there at the pet cemetery for Dorothy was to find the treasure. Apparently, along with all the other rumors about Dorothy, there was another rumor that hundreds of thousands of dollars were, buried somewhere on Dorothy's property. And Elkin had become obsessed with finding it. but he said he never did. When Vallelongo heard this, he felt his pulse pick up. He'd never heard this treasure rumor, but it wasn't any crazier than any of the other rumors he had heard about Dorothy. And if Elkin was that serious about finding, said treasure, maybe he'd gone to Dorothy and tried to force her to tell him where it was. But before he could say or do anything, the officer told Vallelongo not to get too excited, because Elkin had an alibi for the night Dorothy went missing, and it checked out. However, the officer said that Elkin had mentioned something else that could help with the investigation. According to Elkin, there was somebody in Dorothy's life who befriended her for the sole purpose of trying to inherit everything she owned, and that person was Patricia Newman. And as soon as the officer said that, Vallelongo's gears in his head began to turn, and he thought, why didn't I see this before? After all, it was Patricia who called the authorities. She's also the one who aggressively pushed this investigation in the early days, which, Vallelongo had assumed was just because she was worried about her friend. But now he was starting to wonder if maybe she was trying to make herself look innocent. It's not unusual for killers to try and insert themselves into investigations to seem cooperative or to cast suspicion on other people. Patricia had also entered Dorothy's house multiple times before Dorothy's body was found, which certainly gave her an opportunity to interact with the scene and potentially hide evidence. And so Vallelongo turned and ran to go find Strada. They needed to speak to Patricia immediately, and this time it would be as a suspect. On May 8th, so 6 days after Dorothy was found in the river, Vallelongo once again met with Dorothy's close friend, Patricia Newman. But this time, the meeting was inside of a police interrogation room. And as Vallelongo sat at the interrogation table looking at Patricia, he was watching her very carefully. She did seem somewhat annoyed that she had been called in for this, but she also seemed very nervous. In particular, she kept fidgeting with her hands. Now, Vallelongo had really considered his approach here. Since Patricia could have been lying to him this whole time, his plan was to start off pleasant and kind of lull her into a false sense of security that he believed everything she had said was true so far. And then at some point he would surprise her with a sharp left turn and see how she reacted. So he started with some background questions about Patricia's relationship with Dorothy and nodded appreciatively as Patricia explained how she and Dorothy were good friends and Patricia also took care of her. But then, kind of out of nowhere, Vallelongo asked her about Dorothy's estate and if it was valuable or not. She did say that Dorothy owned the house and the land it was on outright, so no mortgages or anything, so it had to be worth something, but she didn't know how much it was worth. Vallelongo responded to this by saying, okay, forget the financial worth of the property. Is the property worth something to you, Patricia? At that point, Vallelongo could clearly see, Patricia realizing what was happening here. She had this alarmed look on her face, like she was starting to see that she was not being treated like a witness, but rather a suspect. And so Patricia quickly said, no, the property was not worth anything to her. She didn't want it, not at all. But she kind of turned it around on Vallelongo and said, look, if you're looking for someone who does want that property, well, you ought to speak to the Notiers. Now, Vallelongo knew who she was referencing. These were the folks who were embroiled in that lawsuit with Dorothy before she went missing and was found dead. But Vallelongo didn't say anything. He just sort of gave Patricia a look like, oh, explain what you mean. And so Patricia took the cue and told him that the Notiers had been Dorothy's live-in employees for years, and they were complete monsters. She said that Brandon had been verbally abusive towards Dorothy while he worked for her, and also he was one of the main people spreading all these rumors about Dorothy in town, about how he thought she killed her husbands and how her land was haunted and she was crazy. But she said that wasn't even the worst of it. She said Brandon was also a thief. She said the year before, when Dorothy was on a lot of medication for depression, like more than normal, and she was not of sound mind as a result of it, she said that Brandon and his wife Bonnie had convinced her to sign over her property to them for basically nothing. And that's when it hit Vallelongo. Like, he was aware that there had been this lawsuit over the land, but he didn't really have all the details about it. He just knew there was some dispute. And he also knew that Dorothy's lawyer had mentioned the Notiers days ago, but that was also right before Dorothy's body had turned up and things had been sort of hectic, and so Vallelongo had not followed up with her lawyers yet. And so he didn't really have the context of, how nasty this legal fight really was. Patricia said she had convinced Dorothy to get a lawyer and to fight this, that it was not right they were doing this to her. And Dorothy had done that. She'd gotten a lawyer, and in fact, her and the Nodier's court date had happened just 10 days before Dorothy went missing. As Vallelonga was listening, it was like he couldn't believe it. This was so obvious, and it was right in front of him the whole time. The Nodiers would clearly benefit from Dorothy's disappearance, and pretty clearly, there was real beef between the parties. So at this point, Vallelonga kind of shifted tactics and was less interested in looking at Patricia as a suspect, and instead assured her that, you know what, he would speak to them. Now, Vallelonga did speak to Patricia for a bit longer. I mean, she was still a suspect. She was very close to Dorothy, who was this older woman with no obvious heirs, and Vallelonga had not seen Dorothy's will yet, but, he wouldn't be that surprised if Patricia was in there. And if she was, that would prove she would have also benefited from Dorothy's demise, just like the Nodiers would. But regardless, Vallelonga knew he was well overdue for a conversation with the Nodiers. So they were going to be his next call. 3 days later, in the afternoon on May 10th, Vallelonga found himself back in the precinct's interrogation room. But this time, it was a bit more crowded. He'd managed to track down 31-year-old Brandon Nodier for an interview. And while Brandon had agreed to talk to Vallelonga, he had also insisted on having his lawyer present as well, which immediately signaled to Vallelonga that Brandon likely had something to hide here. Vallelonga had looked into Brandon's background since speaking to Patricia, and he found out that Brandon had a criminal record, which included assault. Vallelonga also spoke to a few people in town about Brandon, and he had been told that Brandon apparently had a very hard time keeping his mouth shut. He apparently consistently seemed to threaten or go off on people whenever he got even marginally upset. He was a hothead and a loudmouth. So, given all this, Vallelonga expected Brandon to be at least somewhat antagonistic or defensive in this interview. But when Vallelonga asked him about this, highly contentious lawsuit with Dorothy, Brandon didn't seem like an angry loudmouth at all. Instead, he just seemed confused. He explained the whole thing really was just a big misunderstanding. Brandon said he and his wife had known Dorothy for 6 years and actually lived with her for part of the time. And from his point of view, he thought, Dorothy viewed them as sort of like family. And that's also why he said he believed she was selling them her land at such a low rate. It was like a family discount. He said it just sort of seemed like she really wanted them to have her property. And it was actually Brandon and his wife that had sort of insisted on paying for it. Brandon said, everything about this transaction had really been fine and above board until Patricia Newman got involved. Brandon seemed very frustrated as he began to explain how he didn't really know what had happened, but Patricia somehow got into Dorothy's head and convinced her that he and his wife Bonnie had somehow taken advantage of Dorothy. And Brandon saying that didn't happen. That's not how this went. Brandon said, as far as he was concerned, it actually seemed like Patricia was the one who was taking advantage of Dorothy. And then he said there were actually all these times when apparently Patricia was staying with Dorothy, and at some point they would get into some kind of fight, and Patricia would get mad at Dorothy, and Dorothy would flee her own house and run to the Nodier's house, for protection, for safe haven. They said that was fairly common. Patricia was this awful person that, Dorothy had to flee from. As Vallelonga heard this, he kind of didn't know what to think. I mean, Brandon could be lying to him, but truthfully, Brandon seemed very convincing. And also, Brandon just didn't really seem smart enough to be a master manipulator here. In fact, if anything, Brandon seemed kind of dense, and it was hard to believe he could engineer this murder without leaving behind any evidence or witnesses, and then also concoct this sort of brilliant story about how Patricia really was the one behind this whole thing. But Brandon's wife, Bonnie, was a suspect too, and it was possible that, she was the ringleader, and Brandon had just sort of followed along. They were divorced now, but if they were wrapped up in this lawsuit with Dorothy together, it was possible they could have, come together and joined forces to take care of the problem, i.e., get rid of Dorothy. All that's to say, Vallelonga was not going to eliminate Brandon as a suspect just yet, but he needed more evidence before he could connect him to the crime. So ultimately, he told Brandon he could leave and that he would be in touch. And then Vallelonga watched as Brandon and his lawyer stood up and filed out of the room. It was sort of funny in a dark way that just a few days ago, Vallelongo couldn't see any reason why anybody would want to kill Dorothy. And now it was like everybody in Dorothy's life, Elkin, Patricia, and now the Nodiers, wanted Dorothy's money and so really would benefit if she went away. And so now he just had to figure out who wanted Dorothy gone the most. About 5 months later, in October of 1985, Vallelongo stood in the middle of Dorothy's pet cemetery along with Sergeant Strada in total disbelief, because all around them, almost every single tombstone had been completely smashed. Now, Vallelongo had no idea who had done this, but it was sort of oddly fitting, because just like this cemetery, Vallelongo's homicide case was a complete and total mess. Since May, Vallelongo and some other investigators had questioned both Patricia and Brandon Nodier multiple times, but all they ever did was point the finger at the other one. And now, the two primary suspects in Dorothy's murder were essentially at war over her property. After Dorothy's will was read, it would turn out that Patricia Newman had inherited a huge chunk of her estate, including whatever proceeds came from the cemetery business. But the Nodiers were saying that no, you cannot just give that to Patricia because the property is theirs and so the business is theirs because Dorothy had signed it all over to them. And the lawsuit to overturn that sale, despite it being very contentious, it had not been resolved yet. So you can't just shuffle it over to Patricia. And on top of that, Bonnie Nodier, Brandon's ex-wife, had literally moved into Dorothy's house, making it even more complicated. And so that was why the St. Bernard Sheriff's Department and the state police were at the pet cemetery right now. Patricia was there and trying to get access to the house since she needed to get some of Dorothy's things, and Bonnie wouldn't let her in. Now, the uniformed officers had just gone there to make sure everybody played nice. But Vallelongo and Strada had tagged along specifically to try to ask Bonnie a few questions. Now, Bonnie was still very much a suspect in Dorothy's murder, but so far, investigators had actually not been able to interview her. And Vallelongo had hoped that maybe this was their chance. However, when they arrived, Bonnie was extremely angry and she refused to speak to anyone and told all the officers and Patricia to get off her property. And even though the officers, along with Patricia, had eventually gotten inside and Patricia took what she needed, the officers had not been able to get Bonnie to say anything to them. She refused. And so now, Vallelongo and Strada walked back to their cruiser, past all these shattered tombstones, feeling very frustrated that they had multiple suspects here and no way to eliminate any of them. Brandon Nodier would directly benefit from Dorothy's death, because if she was dead, then the lawsuit he was embroiled in would get dropped and he would by default take control of Dorothy's land. He also had a criminal record and, according to Patricia, had been horrible to Dorothy when they lived together. Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie, could have helped him do it, too, since after all, she was named in that lawsuit as well. And she had taken full control of Dorothy's house after she died, so clearly she was intent on living there. But Patricia also could have been highly motivated to get Dorothy out of the picture, since she was named in the will. And she'd seemed really controlling of Dorothy and had repeatedly inserted herself into the investigation. And then there was the handyman, Elkin Childress, who had been eliminated through his alibi, but Vallelongo felt like he deserved another look. He had admitted that he was obsessed with finding treasure on Dorothy's property, and now all the gravestones were mysteriously smashed, which could indicate that maybe he had come back and this was, part of his attempt to find the treasure. Maybe they were inside the gravestones. Then again, if they're going to treat Elkin like a suspect, well, then anybody who had heard rumors about the treasure on Dorothy's land was also a suspect. And considering how the residents of St. Bernard clearly gossiped a lot about Dorothy, it seemed like that would mean basically everyone in town was a suspect. But without any forensic evidence or witnesses, Vallelongo didn't see how they would ever be able to connect anybody to this crime. Still, he and Strada got back in the cruiser and headed back to the station to keep at it. The investigative team kept working this case diligently for weeks and then months, interviewing and re-interviewing suspects and speaking to people who knew Dorothy. They even met with a psychic who claimed she knew who the killer was. And some people even called in with tips that they had seen Dorothy's ghost in the area, and they would even go follow up in case maybe Dorothy was there. But none of that went anywhere. None of it amounted to any new, meaningful evidence that the police could actually use to bring somebody to court. And as time went on, Dorothy's case changed hands multiple times before finally going cold. "24 years later, on a Thursday afternoon in late September of 2009, Detective John Duran sat at his desk in the St. Bernard's police precinct doing some paperwork. And he just put his pen down and leaned back in his chair to take a break when another detective poked his head in and told Duran, hey, the caller was on the phone. And Duran knew exactly who he was talking about. A few days ago, an anonymous caller had put in a tip to say he had information about an old cold case from 1985, the murder of the lady who owned that pet cemetery. And Duran had known immediately that the caller was talking about Dorothy Thompson. Duran had actually used to cut the grass at the pet cemetery when he was 15 years old, and so he and his friends knew all about Dorothy. How she was, this eccentric recluse who potentially murdered people and who turned up dead one day. But during the first call, this tipster had gotten spooked and hung up without giving his name. And as soon as Duran picked up the phone to speak to the caller, he immediately said, whoever this is, you're not going to get in any trouble here. We just want your name and your location. I want to come talk to you and just hear what you know. You're not going to get in any trouble. Can you do that? There was a pause, and then the caller reluctantly agreed. Later that day, Duran and another detective sat in the living room of a New Orleans home, right across from a very fidgety-looking older man. The man's eyes kept darting all around the room, and periodically he kept looking over his shoulder like somebody was going to, jump out at him. And it occurred to Duran as he was watching this guy that he didn't just seem nervous, about the information he was going to spill to them. He actually seemed pretty genuinely terrified. But finally, the man took a steadying breath and said he knew who killed Dorothy, and he had known for years. Now, the guilt of knowing was haunting him, literally. He told the detectives that he had been seeing Dorothy's ghost, covered in chains, and asking him to come forward. Now, at this, Duran raised his eyebrows skeptically, but didn't say anything. This was a pretty crazy start to the story and pretty hard to believe. But at the same time, it didn't really matter what, prompted this guy to come forward. It mattered what he had to say. And so, with an open mind, Duran, along with his partner, just sat there and waited. And eventually, the old man, despite being very scared and timid, finally did just come out and say what he knew. Based on a decades-long investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Dorothy Thompson on the night of April 13th, 1985. Sometime after 9 p.m. that night, the killer was sitting behind the wheel of their truck, making their way up the long, winding driveway through the woods towards Dorothy's house. And as they drove along, the killer found themselves sort of looking out the window and taking in the sights, the tombstones, the trees, the house up ahead, the whole property, taking it all in. And as they did that, they thought to themselves that it was time to stop waiting for their fortune to arrive. They needed to take it. Because Dorothy did not deserve to have this. In fact, the killer believed Dorothy didn't deserve to live. And so the killer eventually arrived right outside of Dorothy's house, and they stopped their truck, they threw it in park, and then, calm as can be, they got out and they walked around to the back of the house. There, they knocked. And eventually, Dorothy, made her way to the door, and she looked out through the glass and she saw this person, the killer, and she looked confused. But it didn't stop her from opening the door. And as soon as she did, the killer didn't hesitate. They jumped on top of her. Dorothy tried to scream, but the killer immediately wrapped their hands tight around her throat, and she went silent. And then in silence, they strangled Dorothy until she stopped moving. Then, once Dorothy was crumpled, lifeless on the ground, the killer found some sheets and wrapped them around Dorothy's body and then dragged her outside to the waiting truck. Once they put Dorothy's body in the truck, They drove to a section of the Mississippi River not far from Dorothy's house. There, the killer got out, and they grabbed Dorothy's body and they tied her hands and her feet together and also, just in case, put a plastic bag tightly over her head. Then they wrapped her body in chains. And then once she was all prepped, the killer, calm as can be, lifted her body up, walked over to the Mississippi River, and threw her in. Moments later, the killer was back inside their truck, driving along, feeling better than they had in months. Because now that Dorothy was gone, all their problems were solved. It would turn out Dorothy Thompson's killer was indeed Brandon Nodier. He had not only tricked Dorothy into selling him her land at a very cheap price, but also, when she figured out he had basically conned her, she sued him at Patricia's urging. And when that happened, Brandon thought, okay, well, if I just kill Dorothy before this lawsuit gets dismissed, because they're going to figure out that this was not fair, that I did con her, if I kill her now, well, by default, the charges get dropped and the sale goes to me. The property is mine. On the night of the murder, Brandon was not alone. He actually asked another one of Dorothy's former handymen, a guy named James Tregler, to come along with him and basically just wait in the car. And so he had done that. Now, Brandon was an incredibly violent person, and he did not think twice about murdering Dorothy to make sure the lawsuit got dropped. But Brandon also had a famously big mouth, and he told his entire friend group what he had done. And so basically, all of Brandon's friends were aware of this horrible crime, and they totally believed what he said because they were fully capable of him being able to commit extreme violence, but they were scared of him. And that's why none of the friends came forward to say, what they knew. But finally, one of these friends was so haunted by their knowledge of this crime that they did eventually come forward. That was the caller who, told the detectives what happened. And in their rendition of what happened, they said Brandon didn't act alone. There was somebody else, a guy named James Tregler. And so as a result of that tip, it would take another 4 years, but they would ultimately speak to James Tregler, and he would confess to having been there on that night. And with that, they had enough evidence to finally charge Brandon for the murder. Brandon ultimately surrendered to authorities in 2012, and he would get a 10-year sentence for pleading guilty to Dorothy's murder. Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie, was not involved. As for James Tregler, the other handyman who drove with Brandon on the night of the murder, he always maintained that he didn't know the murder was going to happen, and so he was given immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony. Even though the pet cemetery is still standing today, it's now abandoned and totally overgrown. However, treasure hunters continue to walk around the property, with their metal detectors, hoping that they'll be the ones to finally find the treasure that's buried there. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, See ya. You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. Today's story starts like many other true crime stories. However, this one comes with a very unexpected twist at the end, one that is exceptionally brutal and graphic. As such, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please deliver a box of Girl Scout cookies to the 5-star review button, but before you hand them over, eat them all and replace them with stale saltines. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Brittany Norwood was born in 1982 in Federal Way, Washington, which is a small city located about 20 miles south of Seattle. Growing up, Brittany's family never had much money. Her father, who was the primary breadwinner, ran a small upholstery shop in town, and while he worked tirelessly, he barely earned enough money to make ends meet. And considering how large Brittany's family was, she was one of 9 siblings, the lack of financial resources at times made life very challenging. However, Brittany's parents were not complainers, and they instilled in all of their children the importance of hard work regardless of circumstance. And clearly that message resonated with their children because by the time Brittany was a teenager, her older siblings had already gone on to become doctors, engineers, and management consultants. As for Brittany, she was just as ambitious as her older siblings, but her interests were in athletics. By the time she was in high school, she had become one of the very best soccer players in the entire state of Washington. She was so good, in fact, that by her senior year of high school in 2000, the best college soccer programs in America were actively recruiting her. She would finally settle on attending Stony Brook University in Long Island, New York, because they offered her a fantastic scholarship and they were known for their excellent soccer program. Brittany was incredibly proud of her scholarship. It not only represented the hard work pays off motto that her parents had preached all of her life, but it also lifted a serious financial burden off of her parents. So in the fall of 2000, Brittany left Washington State and headed east to New York to begin her collegiate career. But right away, she struggled. Brittany had never left home before, and now she was suddenly 3,000 miles away from her family and her friends, and she missed them terribly. Within the first few days of being at her new school, she called her family and told them how much she missed them and how she kind of regretted coming to New York in the first place, but they reassured her that she had made the right choice, that these feelings were normal, and she just needed to give it some time. But despite taking her family's advice and sticking it out at Stony Brook, Brittany never really felt like she belonged there. She made friends, she got good grades, and performed well on the soccer team, but with every passing semester, Brittany became less and less connected to the school and the people there and just longed to be home. And so with that in mind, in 2003, so 3 years after she had arrived at Stony Brook, Brittany was at her school feeling down about her situation when she had a serious lapse in judgment. Brittany, who had never gotten in trouble in her life before, randomly stole one of her teammates' things out of their locker. She didn't even know why she did it. It just kind of happened, and then pretty much immediately she got caught. And as soon as she returned what she had taken. She felt horrible and she apologized, but the damage was done. The incident had already been reported to the school, and the school had a very strict code of conduct policy, which theft was in clear violation of. And so Brittany had her scholarship revoked, and without it, her family could no longer afford the school, and so she had to come back home. And when she got home, she felt like she had let her entire family down. And so for the next several years, the shadow of this huge mistake loomed over her like a dark cloud. She just kind of kept her head down and took part-time work here and there, but for the most part, while she was home, she was just sad and directionless. But finally, in 2010, so 7 years after coming home from school, when Brittany was now 28 years old, she decided enough was enough. She was going to stop letting this mistake define her life. She was going to go out and find a career and make something of her life, like her other siblings had. And the career move that seemed to make the most sense to her was becoming a personal trainer. Despite not playing soccer anymore, fitness was still a very big part of her life, and she loved the idea of helping other people get fit and stay fit. And so she began looking at where personal trainers were the most in demand, and she found Washington, D.C. was a total hotspot, and it just so happened 2 of her siblings were already living there. And so that year, she packed up her stuff and she headed out to D.C. as well. When she got there, she had a little cash, but not enough to sustain her longer than a month or 2, so she applied for and got a job with a Lululemon shop. Lululemon is a company that sells yoga athletic apparel. The shop was located in Bethesda, which is a very wealthy suburb of Washington, D.C., and right around the corner from the shop was a gym that Brittany immediately fell in love with and decided would be the perfect gym for her to run her personal training practice out of once she got certified. So a very happy and rejuvenated Brittany began work at the Lululemon shop in Bethesda in late 2010, fully expecting to only be there for a few months before she transitioned to her personal training career. At around the same time Brittany began working at the store, another young woman had started working there as well. Her name was Jana Murray, and she was quite similar to Brittany. She was 30, so 2 years older than Brittany, and she had been raised in a close-knit, modest household in Texas where her parents had preached always working hard and doing the right thing, and she really took that to heart. And like Brittany, Jana was also a star high school athlete, except instead of playing soccer, she was a big track and field star. And actually, she set some records in Texas for the discus throw. But after graduating high school, instead of pursuing athletics in college, Jana had pursued business. She enrolled in the business program at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. After she graduated, she worked in the private sector for a few years before deciding it made sense for her to go back to school to earn her master's degree in business. She was accepted to the very prestigious Johns Hopkins Business School, which was located a few miles from the Lululemon shop where Brittany worked. And by 2010, Jana was in her final semester, and all she had left to complete was a final thesis paper. A thesis is a long essay involving personal research. The assignment was to write about the structure of a company of her choosing. And since Jana was a huge fan of Lululemon apparel, she had decided to write about them. And during her research on Lululemon, she discovered that the company was far more than just clothing. They had what seemed to be a really cool company culture. All employees, no matter how junior, were encouraged to pursue whatever goals they had, even if their goals meant leaving Lululemon at some point. It was like the company fundamentally cared more about their people than their product. And Jana loved that. And so as she's writing this paper, on a whim, she decides to go get a job at a Lululemon store. And the nearest location was the one near her school. Jana figured working at the shop would only make it easier to finish her thesis, since it would provide her boots-on-the-ground information. Also, she just wanted to see for herself if this company was as amazing as it seemed to be. And so her plan was just to work at this shop until her thesis was done, at which point she'd earn her master's and more than likely she would quit and move on with her life. So in late 2010, when Brittany and Jana found themselves working at the same Lululemon shop in Bethesda, they were aware of each other, but really didn't know each other. Their only interactions were when their shifts happened to overlap, which did not happen very often. But when it did, they were perfectly nice to each other. They would chit-chat, but they were coworkers, not really friends. However, a terrifying event was about to link them together forever. On the evening of March 11th, 2011, Jana and Brittany were working together at the Lululemon. It was an uneventful shift. They chatted, they helped customers, and in between all of that, they would knock out whatever closing duties they were responsible for so that when closing time came, they could leave quickly. And then when it was closing time at 8 p.m., the pair did one last sweep of the store to make sure everything was neat and put away and locked, and then they both grabbed their things and headed out the front door. Once they were outside, Jana turned around and she pulled the keys out of her pocket and she locked the front door. And then Jana hopped in her car and she drove off. And Brittany, she turned and began walking down the sidewalk toward the metro train station. But after only a few minutes of walking, Brittany swung her backpack off of her shoulder right in front of her, and she reached inside to fish around for her wallet because her metro train pass was inside of her wallet. And so she's fishing around her bag, she's still walking towards the train, and she can't find it. And so she comes to a full stop, she unzips her bag completely, and she looks inside, and her wallet is not in there. And as soon as she sees that it's missing, she remembers she left it on the break room table at the Lululemon store. And the only way she could go back and get her wallet was if Jaina came back with the keys and unlocked the front door. And so Brittany just stood there for a minute wondering what she should do. She kind of felt bad about calling Jaina to drive back and open the store for her, but she really needed her wallet for a whole bunch of reasons. And so finally, she picks up her cell phone and she calls Jaina. And when Jaina picks up, Brittany says, I'm really sorry, but I left my wallet in the store. Would you mind coming back and just opening the doors for me? I'll run in and I'll get it. Be super quick. And Jaina, surprisingly, was totally fine with this. She actually laughed and said, I left my laptop in the break room and I was going to get it tomorrow, but this is an excuse to go back and get it now. And so Jaina told Brittany she would be back at the front of the store in just a couple of minutes. And so Brittany thanked her, they hung up the phone, and then Brittany turned and she began running back towards Lululemon. When Brittany arrived at the front of the store, Jaina was already there, and Brittany immediately said, I'm so sorry, thank you so much for coming back. And Jaina said, really, it's no big deal. And then Jaina pulled her key out and she opened the front door of the store and they stepped inside. The layout of the store was basically just a big square where the front door entered the square right in the middle of it. So you step inside, you're in this kind of main shopping area. It's just this one square. And then all the way at the back, kind of lined up with the front door, behind the cash registers, was this employee-only hallway that went straight back about 7 or 8 feet. And then it reached this T intersection where if you turned left, there would be another hallway that went straight for maybe 10 or 15 feet, and it would come to a dead end at a door, and that door would lead to a bathroom. And then if you were standing in front of that bathroom door and looked left, there would be another door that led into a very small kitchen. And then if you went back to the T intersection and turned right and looked straight ahead, you would see another stretch of hallway that was about 10 or 15 feet long, and it would look exactly like the left hallway, except at the end of the right hallway, there was no door to a bathroom. It was just kind of a dead end. But at the end of the right hallway, if you walked all the way down it and then turned right, you would see there was a door that led into the break room. So the break room and the kitchen were kind of oriented in the same position at either ends of each hallway. And so the two women go inside the store with Brittany in the front. They get inside, Jaina flips on the lights, and they walk across that square main shopping area. They go past the cash registers into that employee-only hallway. They go straight down, they turn right, they make their way down the right hallway, and then they open the door to the break room, and they go inside. Brittany very quickly found her wallet. It was on the table. She grabbed it. And so after she had her wallet, she just left the break room and began walking back out towards the main shopping area and the front door. Jaina was only a couple of seconds behind her. She grabbed her laptop and then she left the break room. She walked back down the hallway. And as she turned back into the main shopping area, she kind of had her head down. She was fiddling with her laptop and her phone. But even though she wasn't looking up, just looking down, she could tell right in front of her, Brittany had come to a full stop in the middle of the main shopping area. And so as soon as she saw that, she stopped what she was doing and she looked up. And immediately she could see why Brittany had come to a stop. There were now two men wearing all black with black ski masks on that were standing between them and the front door. The following morning, the Lululemon employee who was supposed to come in that morning and open the store and work that day, she turns onto the street that the shop is on and she begins walking towards the front door. It's a bright, beautiful, sunny morning. There are lots of people out going about their daily routines. And so this employee, she walks right up to the front door of the Lululemon. She's not really looking into the store. She's kind of got her head down and she fishes in her pocket. She pulls out her key that opens the front door. She slots it into the lock and she turns it to unlock it. And right away, she feels no resistance. The door was already unlocked. And so this really gets her attention and she looks up, but there's a glare on the glass from the sunlight, so she can't see inside. And so she just pulls the key out of the lock and then she pushes open the door and she takes a very tentative step inside. And right away she sees the entire store is destroyed. There are shelves knocked over, there's clothing everywhere, it's a complete mess. And before she can even process what she's seeing, she hears what sounds like moaning coming from the back of the store, basically back in those hallways. And so this employee is terrified, and instead of going in to investigate, she just turns around and leaves the store and immediately calls 911. And as she's on the phone with police, this man who just happened to be walking by at this moment, he saw her and saw how visibly upset she was. And so he just stood next to her and waited for her to get off the phone with the police. And then when she was, he asked her, what's going on? And she would explain that the door was unlocked, the store is a complete disaster, and I heard moaning inside, and I'm too scared to go in. And so the man says, hey, I'm going to go in there and take a look around because I'm worried there could be someone who's hurt who needs our help right now before the police even get here. And so this man walks through the front door of the Lululemon, and right away, as soon as he steps in, he steps on broken glass and he looks up and the store is completely destroyed. Everything's knocked over. And he immediately hears the moaning coming from the back of the store. And so he very carefully starts walking straight ahead through the store, stepping over shelves that have been knocked down and trying hard not to destroy any merchandise that's on the ground. And when he reaches the back of the store, basically the entrance to this employee hallway that goes straight back, he hears the moaning, but he can't really tell which hallway it's coming from. And so he just calls out like, hey, who's back there? Do you need my help? But there was no reaction. And so he begins walking forward and then he stops. He realizes the ground is slick. And so he looks down and he sees there's a very obvious blood trail from where he is standing straight back down this employee hallway. And the blood trail appears to turn right and kind of disappears out of sight down that right hallway. And so the man is terrified. He turns around and he looks towards the front of the store, kind of hoping that maybe the police or the paramedics would get there. But it's just the employee he had spoken to, and she looks terrified. And so the man decides, if there's someone hurt back here, I really need to go see what's wrong. And so very carefully, he begins walking down this initial hallway, following the blood trail. And then he turns right into that right hallway and he looks, and he can't believe what he is seeing. It looks like the entire right stretch of hallway was covered in blood. I mean, the floors, the walls, the ceilings, everything. There is blood everywhere. However, there's no person. It looks like all this blood kind of turns right and goes into the door at the end of the right hallway, the break room. And so this man knows, okay, obviously someone is very badly hurt, and whoever is moaning is almost certainly in that break room. And so he calls out again to see if this person will call back to him, but it's silent. And so he walks down this right hallway that's soaked in blood, and he gets to the end and he turns right and he grabs the handle of the break room door. He turns the handle and he pushes the door open. And at first he couldn't quite open it. There was something blocking the door from opening, but finally he kind of muscles it open enough that he can look inside, and he realizes what was blocking the door. There was a young woman lying face down on the ground, and her legs had been blocking the door. And this woman was Jaina. And this man, who was not medically trained, immediately understood this woman is deceased. The injuries she has sustained are so bad, there is absolutely no way she is alive. And he immediately thought, she also has likely been dead for some time. This does not look like it just happened. And so he's thinking, who's moaning? Where's the moaning coming from? Is there somebody else in this room? And so he pushes and kind of moves her body out of the way and sticks his head into the break room, and he scans around, but there's no one else in there. But as he's looking around, he hears the moaning again, and he realizes it's coming from the other side of the hallway, at the end of the left hallway. And so he shuts the break room door and he walks back up the hallway to the T intersection. And instead of turning and walking into the main shop, he continues down the left hallway. And he goes all the way down until he's standing in front of the door that leads into the bathroom, and to his left is the door that leads to that kitchen. And as he's standing there, he just kind of yells out, hey, whoever's in here, say something, because he doesn't know what door they're in. And he hears the moaning, and it's coming from the door right in front of him, the bathroom door. And so he opens the bathroom door, and immediately he's struck by all the blood all over the bathroom. And lying on her back on the ground is another young woman. It was Brittany. Her hands were zip tied together and attached to a pipe on the side of the room, and she was covered in blood. There were obvious stab wounds and slash marks and bruises all over her. And at first, this man assumed she must be deceased, and there must be a third person in this bathroom who's doing the moaning. But then he was startled when Brittany made this low, guttural moaning sound, almost like the sound of an animal dying. and he realized that was the moaning he was hearing. It was Brittany. At that moment, the police had arrived. They had rushed inside. They grabbed this man and escorted him out. They secured the scene, and then the paramedics came in, and they would confirm that unfortunately Jana was deceased. And then when they went to Brittany, they found that she was still clinging to life. And so they put her up onto a stretcher and they began wheeling her out. And as she was being brought out of the store, the paramedics began trying to talk to her. And Brittany, amazingly, was able to say a few words. The police, who are also on the scene, they see this, and they're concerned that, she might pass away from her injuries before they get to talk to her. And so sensing she was able to talk, they kind of rushed over as she's being loaded into the ambulance out front, and they would say, "Hey, do you remember anything about what happened to you and the other woman who was in there?" And Brittany was able to tell them that the night before, there had been these two men who were wearing all black. They had ski masks on, so they didn't know what they looked like, and they had robbed the store, and then they had sexually assaulted both of the women. But Jana had apparently fought back so fiercely that they had killed her before they left. And so after she tells police this, the ambulance gets shut up and she's taken away to the hospital. And then the police immediately go into the Lululemon store to get the security footage from inside the shop to see if they can get some footage of the attack and see what happened. But unfortunately, the only camera this store had was on the exterior of the back of the building, just kind of looking out at a parking lot. There were no cameras looking in the store or at the front of the store. You have to remember, Bethesda, where the store was located, was considered to be extremely safe, very low crime neighborhood. And so more than likely, that was why this store did not have a security system. And so very frustrated, the police pulled up the only footage they could, which was this exterior camera. And sure enough, the night before, around midnight, the camera picked up two men wearing all black with their hoods up, running away from the store. And so there was really no way to identify who they were. All they could tell was, one was fairly tall. But nonetheless, they pulled the footage and they gave it to the media. And then that day and into the night, the local news played this footage on repeat, asking people in the area to come forward if they know who these two guys are. But by the next day, when the media and the police investigation had turned up nothing on these two guys, the police added a $150,000 reward for any information about who these two guys were. But after 48 hours since the discovery of this crime, still no one had come forward with any meaningful information about who these guys were, and so the police were kind of at a dead end. And so some of the detectives decided to go back to the Lululemon shop to walk the crime scene again to see if maybe something was missed in the initial search. And so the police, they come back to the shop, and it's being guarded 24/7 by police at this point. There's yellow crime scene tape outside blocking people off. And so the detectives arrive, they go underneath the yellow tape, they go past the security, they go inside, and then one of the detectives just walks straight to the back of the store and just kind of stands there near the registers looking around. And as he was looking around, he began looking at all of the bloody footprints that were on the ground. Now, by this point, all of the prints had been accounted for except for one set. There was a men's size 14 shoe print that had been spotted in several locations in the store, and it was just kind of assumed that it belonged to one of the killers. The thing about this print was that the treads of this shoe were fairly unique. They had a distinctive and fairly easy to recognize pattern to them. The police knew about this shoe print, but to be honest, they hadn't given it much thought because they felt like the print only seemed to confirm that a relatively tall man had been involved in this crime. But as this one detective stood in the back of the store and was just kind of looking around, he noticed a bin of shoes on the ground in the store. These shoes were there for shoppers to put them on when they were getting their pants hemmed and fitted to them. These shoes were not for sale. They were just kind of random shoes that were there effectively as props to make sure people's clothes fit properly. And the detective noticed one of the shoes at the top of the pile in this bin appeared to be a large men's shoe. And so purely out of curiosity, he reached down and he flipped the shoe over to look at the treads. And to his shock, they were an exact match to the unique treads on the size 14 bloody print. But the shoes he was holding were clean. There was no blood on them. So the detectives, they kind of all converge on the shoe, And they're thinking to themselves, did the attackers come in barefoot and perpetrate this attack with store shoes on and then afterwards clean them and leave them behind? Or is it just a crazy coincidence that one of the attackers happened to have the exact same style shoe and size as the one in this bin? They had no idea, but they felt like this was significant and they needed to get to the bottom of why this kind of random shoe in the store matched this print. And they thought the only person who might have more information about what the killer's shoes looked like would be Brittany. And so at this point, Brittany was still in very rough shape, but she had stabilized to the point where the police felt comfortable speaking to her. And so they paid her a visit and they asked her if she could remember anything about her attacker's feet. Did they wear shoes? And if so, what color were they? Anything she could remember at this point would be helpful. But Brittany would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't remember their feet at all. But there was something about the way she just very quickly dismissed the shoes that tipped the police off that maybe Brittany could be hiding something. But the police didn't press her because they knew she had just been in this horrific attack, and they also didn't really have a good sense of what her normal behavior looked like. So they just thanked her and they left. They were planning to speak to her again the following day, but she actually got in touch with them first and offered to have a meeting to go over what happened. And from the sound of her voice, it just sounded like she was just eager to help them. And so the police, they sat down with Brittany again, and they began talking about what happened and kind of going over the details. And they asked her again about the shoes. And again, she said she just didn't know. And then at some point in this second discussion they're having, Brittany kind of offhandedly mentioned something that she believes is just a small detail. But that small detail would ultimately be the thing that would lead police to figure out what actually happened on the night Jayna was killed. This is what happened. Back on March 11th, 2011, so the night of the attack, Jayna and Brittany were working in the store. It was a normal shift. Everything was fine. And then at closing time, they did their duties. They walked outside. Jayna locked the front door, and then they said their goodbyes, and they went their separate ways. Jayna drove off in her car, and Brittany began walking to the metro train station. But Brittany realized she had left her wallet in the break room, and so she called Jayna. And Jayna would tell Brittany that it was no big deal because she had left her laptop in the break room. Back at the front of the store, Jayna double parked her car out on the street, and then she and Brittany headed inside the shop. Brittany would lead the way to the break room at the end of the hallway on the right, and after she got her wallet, Brittany would turn around and leave the break room ahead of Jayna to make her way back out to the main shopping area. And so Jayna was only a few seconds behind Brittany. She was just getting her laptop, and then when she had it, she left the break room, she walked down the hallway, and she turned and began walking into the main shopping area as well. And she had her head down, she was just kind of fiddling with her phone and her laptop. But at some point, she realized, even without looking up, that Brittany had come to a full stop in the middle of the shopping area. So Jayna looks up, and there were not two men wearing all black with black ski masks blocking their way to the front door. In fact, there were no men involved in what happened next at all. The two men that had been seen on the security camera in the back of the building were just two cooks who happened to be hustling by the night of the attack and who happened to be wearing all black. It was just a coincidence. But there was someone standing in the store blocking Jayna from leaving. It was Brittany. Brittany was staring at Jayna, and in her hand was a foot-long square metal rod. It was one of the pieces of metal that normally was anchored into the walls of the store to hold up merchandise. Jayna is so caught off guard by this, she has no idea what the issue is. And so she says to Brittany, hey, calm down, we can talk about this. But Brittany was not trying to talk to Jayna. Brittany was trying to silence Jayna, and she had lied about her wallet to lure Jayna back to the store. This was a setup. Earlier that night, during their shift together, Jayna had caught Brittany stuffing a pair of yoga pants into her bag and had confronted her about it. And it's believed Brittany was worried Jayna was going to tell their boss about it the next day and that Brittany would be fired because of it. And then once again, her life would be derailed and she would be humiliated, and Brittany just couldn't have that. And so as Jayna slowly began to back up into the hallway with her hands up, trying to calm Brittany down, Brittany began to advance on her. And as soon as she did, Jaina screamed and turned and ran down that employee hallway. She turned right and bolted down the hallway towards the break room. She grabbed the break room door and she was trying to get it open, but before she could, Brittany had caught up to her and she smashed her over the head with the pipe. Immediately, Jaina turned around, she put her hands up over her head to protect herself, and she begged Brittany not to hit her again. But Brittany wasn't listening. Brittany just wound up and smashed her across the arms with the pipe. Jaina began screaming out and pleading with her to stop, but Brittany just kept on going. And for the next several minutes, Jaina just stood at the end of this hallway in front of the break room door, just trying desperately to protect herself with her hands. But Brittany was so strong and fast, and she kept striking her on her head and on the sides and anywhere else she could land a blow. The blood spatter on the walls of the end of that right hallway would later reveal that Jaina had gradually moved from a standing position down to the fetal position, meaning Brittany had literally beat her until she collapsed on the ground. And when Jaina hit the ground, she must have known she was trapped. There was no escape route for her, and she was so badly wounded that even if there was a way to go, Brittany was going to catch up to her and Brittany was going to stop her. And so Jaina just began quietly begging for her life. But Brittany had other plans for her. At the end of that right hallway that they were both in, Brittany had noticed a red toolbox was on the ground in the corner. And so around the time Jaina had fallen to the ground and was begging for her life, Brittany dropped the metal pipe and she casually opened the toolbox, revealing screwdrivers, nails, wrenches, hammers, all sorts of tools. And one by one, Brittany began reaching into this toolbox, taking out a tool, and then smashing, cutting, slashing, and beating Jaina with it. It would take Brittany roughly 10 minutes to cycle through every single tool in that toolbox. But shockingly, despite being dealt 330 significant wounds, Jaina was still alive and she was still pleading for her life. Frustrated, Brittany stood up, she chucked the tools on the ground, she turned around and she walked down the hallway all the way to the kitchen at the other end of that left hallway. She went inside and she grabbed a large knife. Then she marched back into the hallway. She went straight down all the way to Jaina. Jaina is still begging for her life, and Brittany just reaches down. She grabs her hair with her left hand and pulls her head forward towards her. Then she takes the knife with her right hand, she raises it up, and she brings it smashing down into the back of Jaina's skull. The knife would pierce her skull, it would pierce her brain, and that would be the killing blow. Once Jaina was deceased, Brittany simply got to work, staging the store to look like a robbery gone wrong. The first thing she did was drag Jaina's body out of the hallway and into the break room. And then once the door was shut, she headed out to the front of the store and just walked straight outside and climbed into Jaina's car that was still double parked outside. And she drove that around the block to a parking lot. And then when she got back inside of the shop, she went to that bin of shoes used for fitting pants. And she took out the size 14 men's shoe, she put them on her feet, and then she began walking around in the pool of blood underneath Jaina in the right hallway and began tracking the bloody prints all over the store to make it appear like a man was involved in the attack. And then after cleaning the shoes, she ransacked the store, and then she grabbed a knife and a screwdriver and she headed into the bathroom where she repeatedly stabbed and slashed herself before tying her hands and her feet with zip ties. At 8 a.m. the next morning, she was discovered. The seemingly small piece of information that Brittany kind of accidentally gave to police during that second meeting, this piece of information that kind of broke the case, that came when the police asked her if she knew what kind of car Jaina drove or if she'd ever been inside of Jaina's car. And Brittany would say, "No, I don't know what it looks like and I've never been inside of it." But a couple of days later, when Jaina's car would be found and the police would search it, they would find Brittany's hair and DNA all over it. So they knew Brittany had been lying to them. And so this is what ultimately led to Brittany's arrest, and she would later be convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please deliver a box of Girl Scout cookies to the 5-star review button. But before you hand them over, eat them all and replace them with stale saltines. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Google, Amazon, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning. But in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with with me. You can send me a message on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just @MrBallen. And yes, I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. Until next time, see ya.